Now that we've worked through our tax model, let's discuss some important facts about taxes. The first important fact about taxes is that, in general, consumers and producers share the burden of the tax. You'll notice in the typical scenario here, where we have upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, we show that when we put the tax in place, the price to the consumer, inclusive of the tax, increases, and the price to the producer, net of the tax, decreases from what it was without the tax. However, the consumer's price doesn't increase by the full amount of the tax. You can see, for example, that this increase is smaller than the total size of the tax. We can also see that the producer's price doesn't decrease by the entire amount of the tax. We say that the tax incidence for the producer is this amount here, which obviously is smaller than the total amount of the tax. In fact, we can think about tax incidence mathematically, and we can say that the tax incidence on the consumer is just the price inclusive of the tax minus the original no tax price, which graphically is this amount here. We can also say that the tax incidence on the producer is the original no tax price minus the price to the producer net of the tax once the tax is put in place. Graphically, we can see that that is in fact equal to this spread here. We can also note that the two tax incidences together equal the overall amount of the tax. So it's important to remember that when we put a tax in place, in the vast majority of cases, some of that tax is going to be pushed on to the consumer and some of it's going to be pushed on to the producer. That said, there are some extreme cases that are the exceptions to this rule that consumers and producers generally share the burden of a tax. And I've outlined the different scenarios here. The first exception that we can think of is a case if we have perfectly elastic demand. So demand is virtually unlimited at this particular price, P star, but we can't sustain demand at any price higher or lower. In this case, we can still draw our tax wedge just like we did here. It just looks a little funny. But we can draw our tax wedge here, and then we can say that the price to the consumer, inclusive of the tax, well, just it has to be at this point here, according to our diagram. And then the price to the producer, net of the tax, is this point down here because they have to be separated by the amount of the tax. In this case, we can see that the consumer and the producer are not sharing the burden of the tax, and in fact, all of the tax burden is getting pushed on to the producer. And we can see that because the price to the consumer, inclusive of the tax, is the same as it was before the tax was put in place. The second exception that we see is the opposite extreme, namely the case of perfectly inelastic demand. So you notice here we drew demand as perfectly inelastic, meaning that regardless of what price the item is at, the quantity demanded does not change. Here, it's a little hard to see because it's not entirely clear where to put our tax wedge. So in a situation like this, if you're ever not clear, you can think about how can I shift the supply or demand curve in order to have this make more sense. We can go back to the first model that we discussed as opposed to looking directly at this tax wedge diagram. Here, it seems a little awkward to put a tax on consumers since it's unclear how to shift a vertical line vertically. So here we can think about a tax on producers. We say, well, if we put the tax on producers, we just move, we get an effective supply curve that goes something like this. So it becomes more clear then that our new equilibrium would be at this point here. And we can use that information to show where the new prices should be. We notice in this case that the price to the consumer ends up being up here, and the price to the producer is the same as the original price before the tax was put in place. Therefore, when we have perfectly inelastic demand, the tax incidence on the producer is zero, because his price is staying the same. And the consumer here is eating the entire amount of the tax. So you can think about when there's perfectly inelastic demand, the entire amount of the tax is getting pushed onto the consumer. Well, this makes intuitive sense, because if the consumer was willing to pay any price for your item, why not just shift the entire tax onto the consumer? The third case that we can think about is that of perfectly elastic supply, which I've drawn here. In this case, suppliers are willing to supply a virtually unlimited quantity of the item at this particular price, but aren't willing to supply at any other price. Here, we can see the tax wedge. We can draw it. Again, it looks a little strange, but we can take our intuition that we see here and apply it to this situation. And what we notice is that, like we had in the last case, the entire tax gets passed on to the consumer. Because when we put our tax wedge in place, we notice that the price to the consumer goes up by the entire amount of the tax, whereas the price to the producer stays at the original equilibrium price. So in this case, we could say that the producer's tax incidence is zero, and the consumer's tax incidence is equal to the entire amount of the tax. Our last exception is the case of perfectly inelastic supply. In this case, we see that supply is a vertical line because a predetermined amount is supplied regardless of what price producers can get for the item. In this case, again, it's a little bit difficult to think about where the tax wedge goes, so we can go back to our earlier models and say, let's think about shifting either supply or demand so that this can make more sense. In this case, shifting supply is a little bit tricky because, again, we're trying to shift a vertical line. So we can think about this as a tax on consumers, because it doesn't matter whether we model something as a tax on producers or a tax on consumers. And we can see that we can draw an effective demand curve that goes like this. In that case, we can see that our new equilibrium with the tax is at this point here, and that this intersection represents the price that the producer gets to keep. So in this case, we see that the producer is having to eat the entire tax because he's unable to charge the consumer a higher price. And the reason that he's unable to charge the consumer a higher price is because the consumer knows that the same supply is going to happen regardless of what the price is, so why not make the producer eat the entire amount of the tax? We can see that that's exactly what happens. That for the producer, the new price is lower than the original no tax price by the entire amount of the tax, whereas the price to the consumer is the same as it was before the tax was put in place. In terms of our definitions, we can say that the tax incidence on the consumer is zero, and the tax incidence on the producer is the entire amount of the tax. As a subpoint to the fact that consumers and producers generally share the burden of a tax, we can note that the relative tax burdens on consumers and producers depend on the relative elasticities of supply and demand. So here I've given two examples. In the first case, we have demand that's more elastic than supply. Remember that higher elasticity just means flatter on our graph, so we can see in fact that demand is flatter than supply. And we can ask what happens when the tax is put in place and who bears the larger burden of the tax. So here, when you draw the tax wedge, put the tax wedge in here and we can compare the original equilibrium price to the producer and consumer's prices with the tax. What we notice here is that when demand is more elastic, the price that the consumer pays just goes up by a little bit. But the price that the producer gets to keep goes down by, at least relatively speaking, a lot. In terms of the formal definitions of tax incidence, we can say that the tax incidence on the consumer is less than the tax incidence on the producer. And we can conclude that when demand is more elastic than supply, the producer pays more of the tax. So more of the tax is paid by the more inelastic party. We can also look at the opposite scenario, namely that where supply is more elastic than demand. In this case, I've drawn supply to be more elastic or flatter than the demand curve. And we can again ask what happens when a tax is put in place. So here I've marked the original equilibrium price before the tax, and I've also marked the price to the consumer and the price to the producer after the tax. And what we notice this time is that when supply is more elastic than demand, the price that the consumer pays, inclusive of the tax, goes up by a lot, whereas the price that the producer gets to keep just goes down by, relatively speaking, a little bit. So again, put formally in terms of tax incidence, we can say when supply is more elastic than demand, the tax incidence on the consumer is greater than the tax incidence on the producer. Or we can say that the consumer pays more of the tax. So again, we see that the more inelastic party, whether it be supply or demand, is bearing a higher tax burden or paying more of the tax. So we can say a little intuitive mnemonic for this is to think that whoever can run from the tax will. And it's the more elastic party that can run from the tax, so it's the more elastic party that's going to end up paying less of the tax. This is equivalent to saying that it's the more inelastic party that's going to end up paying more of the tax. You'll learn in the unit on firm behavior that in the long run in competitive markets, supply is actually very, very elastic. And in the long run, we can either say that it's perfectly elastic or at least very close to perfectly elastic. This has interesting implications for the long run effect of taxes, because this would imply that in the long run, our situation looks like this, and when we put a tax in place, all of that tax ends up getting pushed onto the consumer. So it's just an interesting scenario to keep thinking about as we learn new things about how consumers and firms behave. And we can say in competitive markets, in the long run, it's quite likely that consumers end up paying, if not all, the vast majority of a tax.